Hello, and welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. We're at the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and while most people would tell me there actually is a technical name for it, I'm not going to say it because I'm not going to pronounce it right. I'll say that right now. But in looking at Northern Virginia, a lot of books have been coming out talking about this particular time period and its influence on Northern Virginia. Now, the Civil War itself, one of the bloodiest conflicts ever in American history. And so to help us understand a little bit more about local history in Northern Virginia with the Civil War, we have returning with us Mr. Chuck Mauro, who is an author and filmmaker and has brought a number of books with him along with his films to go ahead and discuss a little bit more about Civil War in Northern Virginia. So Chuck, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
And I know you can say what the 150th anniversary is.
Sesquicentennial.
Yeah, I can't say that.
And don't ask me to spell it.
I wasn't going to. So you have written 5 books. You've produced 2 films.
Yes.
And as we've known from a different episode, you've got a few more that you would like to go ahead and produce in the future. And so certainly a very accomplished individual when it comes to producing both written and visual products. And so I guess, why did you feel inspired to do all of this work?
The very first book I wrote was a book on the Battle of Chantilly. Living in Fairfax County, people don't realize Fairfax County being outside the city of Washington. There were Union soldiers here, there were Confederate soldiers here, a lot of them. There was only 12,000 civilians in the county at the beginning of the war. At one point, there was close to 30,000 Confederates in Fairfax County, followed by 35,000, 40,000 Union soldiers in the war. And then we only had 2 relatively major battles, the Battle of Drainesville and the Battle of Chantilly. Again, we had this interaction of soldier and civilian. From the very beginning of the war, the day after Virginia seceded, Lincoln sent troops into Fairfax County and Alexandria, and the Union troops didn't leave even after the war was over because they stayed in, they came back to their old campsites in Fairfax County before the Grand Review in Washington after the war was over. So there's a lot of different stories and a lot of history right here.
Now, with all this history here, obviously trying to narrow it down to something that you feel you would want to talk about the most. So you talked about your first book here with the Battle of Chantilly. And so what inspired you to write this particular book?
Part of it was I actually live about 7 miles from the battlefield. And at the time I wrote my book, there were no books. There were articles and pamphlets and things about the Battle of Chantilly. So there wasn't enough written that you could just go and find it. So I started, in reality, by tracing the routes of the Union and Confederate troops. I have to admit, I was kind of selfish. I was kind of interested to see if any of these troops walked across my property. Okay, so it was kind of like just a self-interest thing. And then I kind of learned more about where all the troops were. And then actually I was in a photography club, so I gave myself an assignment to go out and photograph a lot of these locations. So that led to a little bit more research. You have to be a little more specific when you're pointing a camera. And then I knew I needed to know a little bit more, so I went out and would give little slideshows, if you will, to different historical groups. And the way it turned out, somebody said, hey, there's a history writing contest in Fairfax County. Why don't you take this research material that you've done and turn it into a book? Well, I had no idea how to do that, so I went out and bought a book about writing a book. And I took it from there, and nicely enough, I won the Nan Netherton Award for writing of history in Fairfax County, and my very first book got published.
That's always a good one to have. Now, there's a story about the Battle of Chantilly I heard, and since you've written this, maybe you'll be able to enlighten us a little more. If I remember correctly, I understand there was a Union general who was killed at this particular battle.
Well, there are actually 2. So the Battle of Chantilly, or Ox Hill, depending on which side you're from, or which side you recall, happened after Second Manassas and before Antietam. So after Second Manassas, the Union Army is defeated. They're retreating back into the eastern portion of Fairfax County, Washington, Alexandria. And General Lee, Confederate General Lee, wants to get between the Union Army and the city of Washington to bring the Union Army to another battle. And he is actually coming east on today's Route 7, while the Union Army is coming, he's actually coming on Route 50, excuse me. Somebody will notice that. And then the Union Army is coming east on Route 29. But the scouts are out, and they know, the Union Army realizes that Lee's scouts are coming. And they actually meet on September 1st, a Monday afternoon, pretty much at the intersection of today's Route 50 and West Docks Road. And it's actually, in this case, it's the Union Army that it's attacking under General Isaac Stevens. And as he goes in to cut off Lee's advance, he sends back for reinforcements. It's on a Monday afternoon, and I think our viewers would appreciate it comes in what I call a severe Washington, D.C. Summer thunderstorm. The participants wrote that the thunder was louder than the cannon and the guns. So Isaac Stevens is leading his troops into a charge, and he actually gets killed. And when his troops pull back on the battlefield in the rain, confusion, and their leaders being killed, General Kearney, who's the help that Stevens sent for, comes across the scene, and he can't believe that there's this hole in the battlefield, and he rides forward to reconnoiter and figure out what's going on. And unfortunately, he rides into the Confederate troops. And the Confederate troops, seeing a Union officer, recognize him and shoot and kill him as well.
Now, the story I've heard is that one of the generals, the spot where he died, is now infamously an oil stain at the Sears Automotive Center.
Not quite. There are two monuments along Monument Drive, aptly named, for both Stevens and Kearney. They're not buried there, but those monuments were put up in 1915. That's pretty much the area where Stevens was killed. Kearney was killed a little bit to the west, probably in the middle of Monument Drive today. But they put the markers there in 1915 to commemorate these two generals.
Well, there's the truth behind the story there, so now we know more. Now, another book you've written is about Herndon, Virginia. And so I've had friends who live out in Herndon. I've been there myself. What can you tell us about that particular area?
Well, Herndon itself, I live in Herndon, okay, so that's kind of my impetus for writing that book. Herndon has a kind of an interesting story. I mean, the first inhabitants in northern Virginia were here, 10,000 years ago, the Indians. And they would move through the area catching game and hunting and so forth. And in 1979, when they were building the Herndon Golf Course, they came across a number of the artifacts for the Indians. And some of these artifacts, 1,000 years old, 4,000 years old, 8,000, 10,000 years old. So they're the original inhabitants of the area. What got Herndon going, if you will, back in the 1850s, the whole area was a farming area. And the Alexandria, Loudoun, and Hampshire Railroad wanted to run a railroad from Alexandria into West Virginia. And so they had to put, railroad stops and stations every so often. And at the time, they put one in, and it's still there today, in the area that's Herndon. And that depot was built in 1857. At the same time, in 1857, we're still in the middle of the gold rush, okay? And ships are bringing gold and passengers back from San Francisco up to New York. And one of those ships that left Panama and goes to New York was commanded by a William Lewis Herndon. And he runs into a really rough weather off of Cape Hatteras. And the ship actually goes down. Out of the 525 some people on that ship, only 152 were saved. Wow. And I dare say, if it weren't for this other ship called the Titanic, we would still hear about the SS Central America going down with William Lewis Herndon. And he actually goes down with his ship. And what happens is, so the train depot was built, and the next year they want to put a post office in the depot, and they need a name. Well, the most famous story of the time is about Commander Herndon, so they picked the name Herndon for the post office there, and that's how the area got its name.
Never knew that story, so it's always interesting to hear. Now, what kind of interesting things have you learned about Herndon and writing the stories and looking at its past?
One of the interesting things was they put the train station there, and as I said, Fairfax turned into quite a dairy farming area. And Herndon was the leader of Fairfax County's dairy production because the farmers could take their 10-gallon milk cans up to the Herndon station, and they would be taken by railroad into the city of Washington, Alexandria, and Georgetown. So Herndon, between actually World War I and World War II, was very famous for its dairy farming. And it had the terrain, had the cows, and as I said, it had a ready form of transportation for these farmers in this area to go ahead and sell their products.
Now, when I see you have one book on Herndon, and you show images of it, and looking at the pictures of old Herndon and seeing it today, how much has actually been built up in, I mean, obviously Herndon is a built-up area, but is there any of that part that was built up but they left some of the original behind? Is there like an old Herndon, new Herndon, or is it just new Herndon and, oh yeah, there used to be an old Herndon, but it's gone?
No, I have to say there's a historic area of Herndon, and it is, we have the second house built in Herndon is still there. The first house was torn down for apartments. But a lot of the original buildings and area around Herndon is actually still there today. Along Station Street and Pine Streets and Eldon Street. It's kind of interesting. One of the things the Herndon Historical Society did was put plaques on some of these old houses that have been around many years. And so we have a lot of history about some of the original structures. And they're still there today.
It's always good to know that it's still there.
Yeah, it's a fun place.
Now, for Fairfax County, you've written about Civil War in Fairfax County, and Fairfax County has a lot of space. A lot of space, a lot of characters, a lot of events going on. And so, when you set out for Fairfax County, was there any specific target mission, so to speak? Like, did you want to say, well, I want to look at this particular area of Fairfax only. I want to deviate away from the course because everyone else has already done this.
A lot of people have written about the wars. I think one of the things that I've always been interested in is the Civil War. And I think most people, when they get interested in the Civil War, the first thing they learn about are the battles. And then, if they, Manassas, First Manassas, Second Manassas, all over, the South. The second thing people think about are perhaps the famous generals, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, and they learn about some of these very famous generals. And then a lot of people today are descendants of some of the soldiers. So a lot of people still today very much treasure their family ties to their ancestors that fought in the war. So there's obviously a lot written about that. And the thing that caught my attention, actually was one of my fellow authors, said one of the interesting stories that nobody's really written about are the civilians. And as I said earlier, in 1860, the census, there was about 12,000 civilians in Fairfax County, and they are totally inundated and overrun by the soldiers, first part of the war by the Confederate Army, and in most of the latter part of the war by the Union Army. And so what was interesting was after the war, there was a Congress, U.S. Congress, instituted a Southern Claims Commission, where for 12 southern states, including Virginia, so that people could ask for reparations if Union soldiers destroyed their property. So what happened was you had to prove you own the property, prove that the Union soldiers took your property, and probably the most difficult thing was that you were loyal to the North. So in Fairfax County, there was 196 claims made, and you had to go before a commissioner, and they would write all this information down. So going to the National Archives, one could very quickly see how the civilians lived, because not only would they say, well, my fencing was taken by the soldiers, my woods were chopped down. They took Union soldiers, and even Confederate soldiers, when they came by, if they camped in your farm, they would take anything they needed, food, bedding, housing, wood. And you go read through these claims, and you get a very good picture of how difficult it was to live, in Fairfax County during the war.
Now, what were some of the, now obviously you've taken food, wood, clothing. Were there any really absurd claims that people put out there like, oh, they took my prized Mona Lisa, give me money? Because we see people today say, yes, I had the Mona Lisa in my trunk, now give me $1 million. Was there anything like that?
Some of the perhaps more humorous stories where soldiers would get after, people would bury their valuables literally in the ground when the soldiers were coming. And of course, the parents wouldn't give that up, but the soldiers would get after the kids. And the kids would tell them perhaps where the gold and silver were buried. One of my favorite stories is about where the soldiers would come for food, and they would take pigs. And one of the stories I write about is about a young lady who gets very upset when her very own pet pig gets taken by the Union soldiers. And she goes and she takes her servant and goes over to the Union camp and points out to the officer who was the gentleman who stole her pig. And the officer has the soldier give back the pig, and then the poor young lady gets her pig back. So.
Well, it kind of makes me think of Charlotte's Web. It's like,
There you go.
So it kind of puts an interesting scenario there for that particular story. Now, with civilians in Fairfax County in the Civil War, you don't really think about those people at all. Now, are you related to any of the soldiers on either side? Is that part of the inspiration, or was your family civilian? Because I know with the Chantilly and the Herndon, you have a connection that you were very curious to know about. Does the Civil War in Fairfax County book have a connection for you?
Not particular. I have a Union ancestor that fought, but it was nowhere near here. But it's where I live now, and it's kind of like, okay, you drive by these places every day, and you kind of wonder, were the soldiers here? Did they camp here? Did they travel through here? So I think every time you go through Fairfax County, you have a good chance that somebody was there at some point in time.
Now, you have written a book that is specifically about a single person, and that is Laura Ratcliffe. And so, for those who don't know much about her, who is she?
Laura Ratcliffe, now I live actually by Frying Pan Park, over by Centerville Road. This one Southern lady, Laura Ratcliffe, lived on Centerville Road, a little bit to the south of me during the war. And she was like many civilians. She would provide information to Jeb Stuart, John Singleton Mosby, whenever they would come through Fairfax County about the Union soldiers. She actually lived a little bit south of Frying Pan Church, which is still there today. And Frying Pan Church was a Union picket post. So if people think about it, Route 50, Route 7, Route 29 were very major east-west highways, and Centerville Road was a north-south highway. So there were always Union soldiers around. And Mosby and Stewart would stop at her house many times during the war to gather information. They could stop for food, they could stop for rest their horses. But I think a lot of people know about Antonia Ford. Stewart gave her a little captain's certificate, and that got found, and she got arrested. Well, with Laura, he actually gave her an album, okay? And in this album, he wrote 4 poems to her. And today we look at them truly as love poems. But what Stewart was doing was he was counting on her to provide information, literally to be a spy. So when he came into Fairfax County, he could have places, trusted civilians that he could go to and get information. So he wrote these poems. He was a married man, of course. But the other interesting thing about this album is the custom of the day was when you went to somebody's house, you would present a card. You had a calling card. And the host or hostess could either admit you, or they had up to 3 days to let you know when you could come back. So during the war, we've got soldiers coming to Laura Ratcliffe's house. So what she did on the blank pages of this album was to draw little calling cards. So you have a page of John Mosby and about 10 of his men visiting Laura and signing their names. Jeb Stuart and about a half a dozen of his men. Brigadier General Fitzhugh Lee, who was Robert E. Lee's nephew, and a number of his men, signing this, in a sense, autographing this book as they came through Fairfax County. So the fun part of the book was identifying who all these soldiers were, and since none of the signatures are dated, actually trying to figure out when these people could have been here. So I find her very fascinating.
Now, whatever happened to Laura?
She lived out through the war. After the war, she moved to a house which is still there today called Marybrook that her mother purchased. Her mother passed away, and then Laura's sister was an invalid, and she took care of her sister until she passed away, and then she marries her next-door neighbor who was from New York. So at the age of 50, Laura marries a northerner, and she lives for 87 years, and she dies in 1923. And she's actually buried up by today's Worldgate Marriott, right outside the front door, because that was property that her sister owned.
Amazing little things you don't expect to learn
No.
about.
Again, all these little places in Fairfax County.
Yeah. Now, you've produced 2 films.
Yep.
Your first film is The Battle of Chantilly, and the second one is Mosby's operations in Northern Virginia. And so, what made you decide to get into filmmaking?
After I wrote the book on the Battle of Chantilly, I got a phone call one night from a filmmaker in Chantilly and said, hey, I like to do, he's done Civil War documentaries, would you like to do a film together on the Battle of Chantilly? And I have to admit, I was kind of stunned for a second. But then I thought about it. I said, well, I never really intended to write a book, and I ended up writing a book. And I said, well, obviously I got to write a screenplay here. And it took me about 4 months, and I distilled it down. And we had a great time. We had actors, we had reenactors. We actually filmed on the actual battlefield. The story is, it starts in 1883 when some of the Union soldiers are coming back to visit the battlefield. And by then, it's owned by a Confederate veteran. And so they actually come and they spend the night in 1883. And so we kind of introduce the story that way. We go back and actually show film the battle itself. We actually filmed in Frying Pan Park because a lot of the battle was in a cornfield, and we needed a cornfield, so I got permission from the county to film there. And then in 1915, they actually put these 2 monuments to these 2 soldiers, Kearney and Stevens, as we talked about. So we actually filmed an unveiling. Again, it's a good history in Fairfax County, and it tells the whole story.
Now, in producing these films, you said for one you've used reenactors, the other one you didn't. And so, what are some of the bigger challenges in trying to create a film on something where, in today's society, a lot of what you're trying to film loses its sincerity? For instance, on Monument Drive, where you have your 2 generals being killed, you're not going to be able to tell where it is, because, I mean, you have enough people who would say, oh, well, I didn't know those apartment buildings were there back during the Civil War. You're going to have that person who's going to ask that question. So what kind of challenges did you find presented itself for you in making these movies?
As usual, when you're taking pictures or filming, you have to be very careful, obviously, about where you aim the camera. So we certainly did the filming on the actual battlefield away from the intersections. There were times we had to stop and start over and stop and start over because a motorcycle would go by, an airplane would go ahead. So you do multiple takes, and eventually you'll get enough pieces so you can put the scene together, and you don't see the apartments and you don't hear the motorcycles. Frying Pan Park, we filmed. We had reenactors. They were shooting their guns. The police came by and wanted to know what was going on because they were getting reports of people hunting in Frying Pan Park. So we had to stop and we had to take care of that. In the 1883 scene that I talked about, we actually filmed indoors because these 2 soldiers come back to the Confederate soldier's house. And we were actually very lucky there. I know the owner of Marybrook, which is where Laura Ratcliffe lived after the war, and it was 1700s house. So we actually filmed part of the Battle of Chantilly in Laura Ratcliffe's dining room. So we did that there. So
It always creates a lot of fun for you when you're
Sure.
actually there. And so, with all the work you've done in creating history for Fairfax County and talking about Civil War, combining all, what do you hope people would get as something to take away from what you've given them into the world of history?
Fairfax County, people just may not think of it today, but there is quite a bit of history in Fairfax County. As I said, the Civil War, we're in the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary. So there's a lot going on in Fairfax County. It's hard to read a newspaper these days about having this event or that event. And I certainly hope that people go out and avail themselves of some of these events because you're going to learn an awful lot. The books obviously go into a lot of the Civil War in Fairfax County. And again, I'd like to talk a little bit about the civilian population, the other side of the soldiers in the battles, and to what it was actually like to live here, to get a real feel for that.
Well, certainly we could talk forever and ever, but unfortunately can't. And so before we leave, I'd like to go ahead and give you from us here at Virginia Time Travel a small little gift. It'll give you something else to look forward to.
Oh,
While
thank you.
not in Fairfax, it's certainly close enough. To learn more about Civil War in Fairfax County, Northern Virginia, you can visit our website at www.timetravel21.com. Email us at timetravel21@yahoo.com, Or you can go ahead and visit Chuck Mauro's website at hmshistory.com. This has been Virginia Time Travel, your portal of the Commonwealth's past, present, and future, and we hope you'll tune in once again.